Okay, folks, here is week 12, the assignments that you have due. You'll see the announcement hopefully later tonight. But you still have you got to read finish reading chapter 6, should be reading through chapter 7. In Worlds Together, Worlds. I love this, Worlds Apart. Come on, where is it? And also, keep in mind that this lecture is going to be ready for you and should be ready right away once it gets posted. And of course, don't forget you have your fourth semi-weekly question due. Remember, you should have initial post by Thursday or Friday and one response. And remember, here is the thing. We talked about the Second Punic War. Talk about some of the changes in the expanding power of Rome. That's where you should be focused. Let's go back to the Qin. The Qin Dynasty here is quite an amazing event, even though it didn't last very long. It's kind of interesting. This is sort of a departure from many of the history of there were the many very different states that there were in China. We often forget that China, we see this as this one unified entity, and for the last 2,000 so years or so, with minor difficulties, it pretty much has been. But it didn't always start that way, and so we're going to kind of bring that in a little bit. The concept of United Empire actually goes back with the beginning of the Qin in the 3rd century BCE, with the first emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, and well before this, well before the first Qin Empire, there was the concept of a large unified state. It would, and of course this began in somewhere around 221 BCE, but before that there was some sense of a unification. And what were some of these things? For example, there were concepts of cultural and ideological unity that developed over at least 1,000 years prior to this. It would also be ahistorical to say that from the 3rd century BCE, China's natural form was a unified polity, or body politic, if you will. A lot of Roman historians believe that their empire, and some of them lived to be disappointed, was the same way, and this is the same thing that happened with the Chinese. But there's no denying that many Chinese have seen their history that way, and this view has contributed to China's so far successful transition from an empire into a more modern state, though still unified, but undoubtedly more authoritarian. Now, the Qin Dynasty, what it's famous for is it's famous for ending the disunity in the period of what we call the Warring States period. Now, this is what it looks like at this time. So about 260, we're talking the middle of the 3rd century. This is what China looks like. You have 7, roughly 7 states that are covered throughout this entire area. There probably could be more, but these are the ones that were more organized. And it's the Qin here that's going to eventually take over the entire area of what we know as China today. Now, with Qin, the Qin Dynasty ends all the disunity that happened during what was called the Warring States period. This was a Western state that was looked upon by some as a barbarous state as late as the 4th century. The Qin prospered in part because of a radical reorganization carried out by legalist ministers with strict adherence to laws and principles. But it also could be perhaps because their soldiers' use of the new long iron sword was important, heavy but important as well. They would later swallow up the Sichuan and area, which was the last that they defeated. And by 221, the unification of China for the first time under an emperor, we see this dynasty which could give the country its context and its shape. The first person, of course, that was important in all this was Ying Zhe. Zhe was born in 259 BCE. He had been a king since he was the age of 13. When you're looking at this too, this kingdom of Qin had already, by the time that, Ying Zheng becomes king, the Qin was already becoming powerful and ascendant. But it was internally divided. And the young king, as King Zhe, as he was known first, believed that his own family would conspire against him. This was not unusual. He sentenced his mother to house arrest, had her reputed lover drawn and quartered and torn to pieces by 5 chariots. That's literally not something you want to see. His father's prime minister was forced later to commit suicide by drinking poison. I mean, this sounds like a real fun place to be, doesn't it? I mean, you want to talk about intrigue? But by 230, he seems to have set out a plan to defeat all other states, and he would proceed with it in a very orderly fashion, even when his own people counseled against it. I mean, think about that. Usually, I mean, he had you could call it foresight. Some could call, foresight it because it worked. If it hadn't worked, he probably would have been the last emperor, so to speak. Anyway, so by 223, he defeated the largest state of the Warring States era, the Chu, which was in south-central China. 2 years later, he captured in the north the Qi in the Shenandoah area, the last remaining independent state from the Warring States era. He declared a new country. He even invented new titles for himself, being first emperor, and of course for all of his other officials that he would put in power. He would turn the south. He would turn south again. That had no Chinese state successfully penetrated into this area. And what are we talking about? Well, by 213, his empire reached as far south as what is now Guangdong province in the south of China, and his troops had actually entered Vietnam and other areas in Southeast Asia along the borderlands. And all Chinese recognized that this was no ordinary state and no ordinary king. Later, of course, we know him as Shi Huangdi, and Shi Huangdi believed in a strong central empire. I don't know an emperor that doesn't like a strong central empire for some reason. It's important to have to hold those reins of power close to you for a while, and why? How does he project, and how does he begin to bring in some ways to unify? And when we talk about this, I'm going to bring up an important thing that was started back in this period. Let me bring in, can I bring it in? Let's see. These look like, just major pictures, but I wanted to bring in, no, here is what's called the Lingkou Canal. And you see this area, which was in purple. This is remnants of the old canal that's still in China, that's still there. And it was, in 2015, Shi Huangdi was the first emperor who ordered the construction of this canal. Like we can trust this. But let's go back, as far as pictures are concerned, you can see some of the pictures here, if I can move it up. That kind of, yeah, you can even see the weather there today. But here's the biggest thing. You can see these areas that, this is an area that's still around. It enabled people to travel, 1,200 miles. I mean, that's pretty big. So this canal linked the Yangtze to the Pearl River. Rivers, again, were the major superhighways of that period. And it was a lot easier in some ways to build a canal that would be connected by water than, having an overland route that you'd had to, maintain. It's a lot easier to maintain a canal. Also, he built roads to send armies quickly, where, these were developed to send armies, but also to send administrators and proclamations to the furthest reaches of the empire. Don't keep that in mind as well. And, you got to understand, the first Qin emperor was a mixture of unbalanced and cruel megalomania and profound understanding of his times. It was not surprising that perhaps Mao Zedong found him the only emperor to admire in some 1800 years later. We're not going to get that far, but that's important. What Shi Huangdi did is he extended and strengthened the state. In particular, made it, the essence of the Qin Empire, its ability to fight, to hold on to conquer territory. This becomes important. Its basic instrument was the emperor's vast armies, which were created from the peasantry, and command by officers who had been selected for their ability. That's an amazing thing right there. It's being selected for your ability and not because you're some son of some admirer or some family. This was important. Having done this, the nature as it was later understood by many who would write this, that the Qin's nature is the nature of the empire was strong, its terrain difficult, its government severe, its rewards and punishments reliable. And its people do not yield. They are all belligerent. And these were the characteristics that the Qin emperor set out to engrave on all China after 221 BCE. The state, of course, was an absolute monarchy, which attempted to regulate even the most minor details of people's lives. Former elites that had survived the Qin were brought to the capital. They had to live there to be under surveillance, so they wouldn't, they didn't look like they were gonna revolt, and couldn't build up. That's what happened at other times. But he also did some other things that really brought things together. Not only did he, settle a new capital, all the forms of exchange were standardized. For example, weights and measures, money, taxes, these are all important things that come about with not only centralization, but also with trade and commerce. I mean, you have to have a standard measure so that, in the north part of the country, the weights are the same as in the south part. I mean, think about it here in the United States. We don't think about these things, but how do you buy gas? We all buy gas by the gallon. Most of our liquids are by the gallon. What measurements do we use? Well, unfortunately, we use the English system, which is even the English don't use anymore. And again, we have a source of a system that has money, which is, we have paper money. And of course, we have taxes. But he also had another part of him too. The Qin Emperor had a special interest in scholars. There's kind of a mixed bag. He felt they could be dangerous to his enterprise through forms of heterodoxy. They either had to conform to official ideology or choose death or exile. So he brought them definitely under his control. He also centralized great libraries of scholarly information. And access to this became very difficult because it was under the direct control of the state only. You had to have a license. In order to be a licensed scholar, you had to have a license to see this material. And only licensed scholars could see these texts. So therefore, if you're going to write about history, you better be writing it the right way because they're not going to give you access to it. The sad part about the library is that by the time we get to the early mid 20th century, a lot of these libraries are destroyed, and a lot of that it was deliberately done, which is sad. One of the key things you have to remember, though, is that merit was key. Those who advanced to high positions didn't do so simply because of noble birth. He was very skeptical about some of these former nobles because, of course, they were in power in other areas, and he had defeated them. The state would so he developed, of course, we need this merit system because that way who are we going to find for these places? Well, let's do this based on merit. Kind of a nice idea. The Qin Emperor was interesting too. In the ultimate act of coordination, they created the regulated language by the simplified characters and standardization syntax, which is often still used. Creating the common written language for the entire empire. If you wanted to do business in the empire, you had to write in Chinese. Oops, did I go too far? Hang on, sorry guys. Boop. Oh, I didn't want to do that. Where are we? Oh, we're at 17. Good. Hang on. Anyway, so political unity, no doubt, was achieved, and at least it was underway. And of course, these administrative innovations would survive the Qin Dynasty. I'm sorry about that, guys. We have to get that out of there. And even into the 19th, 18th, 19th, 20th century, we see some of these aspects as well. By the time we get toward the end of that 15-year period, we start to see that with all of this, there were a lot of groundwork laid for a unified state on a grand scale. The Qin Empire was vast. It had a cultural core that was mostly around the Yellow River Valley. This is where more than 3/4 of the population lived. And it could spread great distances north and west and south. But the conquest didn't create a unified country until much later. The Yangtze Basin was still considered a frontier zone. And the lands further south and west were regarded as zones of military occupation. Some people were even considered uncivilized tribes. In the north, the Qin conquest brought its emperor into contact with other nomadic groups across Central Asia, sometimes the Mongols and others. And so, although the Qin Empire was only going to last 15 years, okay, it was a great achievement to keep this in mind. And China from this time may be considered the seat of an expanding, self-conscious civilization. There had been earlier signs that of growth, such as the outcome was likely. I mean, given the potential of their own Neolithic cultures and so forth, and the cultural diffusion and some migration from the north. I mean, many of the first shoots of civilization appeared in central and several parts of China before 1000 BCE. But by the end of the Warring States period, 3rd century BCE, some of them showed very marked similarities, which would be offset by some of the differences between them. Political unity achieved by the Qin over a century was sort of a logical corollary of the cultural unification that was already underway. Okay, but even some claim that there's a sense of Chinese nationality that can be discerned before 221 BCE. But, the Qin, well, fundamental administrative innovations, a lot of this stuff would survive the Qin, although the Qin would not themselves. And this would be displaced by the Han Dynasty, which would rule for more than 400 years, with a slight interruption about 9 CE. The Han was founded by a commoner, a guy named Liu Bang. Liu Bang. It's not Bang, it's, and I'm sorry, I'm not very good at Chinese. But for the times, he was a leader of peasant origins who made use of a lot of the chaos that occurred when some former states tried to, regain their independence. Whenever you have a situation, especially in the earlier times when some king dies, that's the time to rebel because there's disunity and lack of direction. And this, of course, is how the Han began. Although the Han continued much of the centralized work of their predecessors, what we do see is that, and maybe, they attempted to show more moderation for their elites, and this is probably why they lasted longer, because the Qin were very, very, could be very cruel and very strict. The Han would rule for 400 years, and the unification and centralization of China with their own dynasty and the person of the emperor at the center of it. The emperor was the embodiment of government. All uncultivated land belonged to him, and all offices were given to those who would accept them as gifts. And of course, his imperial proclamations would create laws, there we go, for everyone who was within the empire. And to make sure everyone knew that, of course, you now have all these roads roads and canals where, information can be spread to other areas. Let's go down. So, Liu Bang was born in 256 BCE. He would found the Han and made Chanyang, the formerly known as Jiang, capital. He was later given the posthumous title, good Lord, I know I was going to say that, of Han Gaozu, known as the great ancestor of the Han Dynasty. Originally, he was a commoner. The new emperor would surround himself with ministers and generals who also had I guess you could say they were also lowly. In other words, I hate to say lowly origins, but they weren't nobles. They weren't aristocrats. And Han Gaozu, is often rated as one of the more competent emperors. And his rule would last for almost 4 centuries. This was an opinion that was lasted for 4 centuries. And you got to give the guy a little bit of credit because, of course, especially when you're trying to form people, you want people that are similar to you and brought about that. Han Gaozu showed really total disdain for Confucianism during the years of life and death struggle when he was fighting to win the throne. Virtue at this time was certainly a luxury he could hardly ill afford. Once he obtained power, often his advisors would caution him that he could obtain an empire. You could obtain an empire by horseback, but you can't control government in the same manner. Think about that. And that becomes kind of an interesting aspect. Especially, hang on. Basic instincts. Yeah. When you look at some of the things that happened as a result of this, it's kind of interesting. They also, some of his advisors would point out some of the inadequacies of legalism, citing three important examples of the short-lived Qin dynasty. One was that Xi and legalism only appealed only to people's basic instincts of greed and fear, not some of their better instincts. It also failed to establish a sustainable regime in society. But in order to do that, you have to have harmony. And the Qin had done this through force, but sometimes you can't always force harmony. And of course, some of the excesses in military conquest and contrition and so forth, and some of these grandiose plans often would exhaust the country's wealth and turn the people against them. And you don't want to do that when you're building a newer state from the beginning. Unlike others, Hang Zhao listened to his advisors and was persuaded by their counsel. And this is probably why the Han outlasted, the Qin for 400 years. So the biggest thing about this, too, was that as he listened to many of his supporters, he understood that China needed to recover from this harsh period. And so he adopted a policy of reconciliation and compromise in general. He began to, I don't know how I want to say this. He started to have he embraced an eclectic approach to statecraft. He combined various elements of Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism to his advantage. The Confucians would emphasize the supremacy of the emperor in a hierarchical order, and would also emphasize harmony among his subjects. And this offered a formula for stable and sustainable regime in society, one that's not always in flux. The legalism would provide the backbone for a very tough and efficient government. You can't second guess rules or the laws. These are what they are. And then the Taoists also had this dictum of restraint that discouraged emperors from going into large scale construction projects, and to the detriment of the state by spending lots of money. And this combination enabled him to reduce taxes and the labor that would be provided for services encouraged peasants would later be able to resettle in various areas. And so after about, a few decades, but then under his rule, we start to see a rebuilding. He creates a new nobility. The country starts to regain its vitality. And we start to see the road to growing a more prosperous country. But he does something else here too that I think is important. Is the new nobility the new nobility were given 2/3 of them were given small little fiefdoms or kingdoms, and these were relatives and supporters of the emperor. Only 1/3 of the entire state was under direct administration. So he loosens the reins a little bit here. He gives some of his supporters, and they have to be pretty good supporters to get this, and because you don't want a rebellion, and of course the other areas that were under state strict administration, was really important. And of course, all this generosity would actually generate support for himself and for the dynasty. And it worked for 400 years between 206 BCE to 220 CE, with a short interruption of about 14 years or so. The Han continued to rule China. The first, we break these into two, and we have to say that the first half of the Han period, in which the capital was at Chang'an in the west, is called the former Han. This lasted from 206 to it should be 220 or it should be 9 BCE. I don't know why it says that. Okay, yeah, 25. And then the second half happens after 25. So you've got a period of time where there's 14 years, and your book is more clear about this. He moderated a lot of the concentration of power, reestablished the earlier system of inherited domains under aristocrats eventually, but the forces of centralization remain very strong and would remain there for quite some time. After about 100 years, another prominent ruler of the Han comes to power, Emperor Wu. He held the throne from about 141 to 87 BCE, so that's, that's about 70 years. And he would expand what he expanded was, not only his power, but he also would expand government's power and he actually ruled with an iron fist, which is not always, after you've had an established system, that kind of becomes an issue. But with that iron fist, he needed a large bureaucracy administered by noble families to make those changes. But Wu does introduce a civil service examination, which determines where to place appointees. He also did something important, and he centralized education. This becomes important too. By doing this, by having education more centralized and not having the private tutors, you're getting a more state-centered type of education, if you will. And because of that, of course, he centralizes education. And this is, of course, because there were private tutors, like Confucius was a private tutor. He taught young men. Wu created a central school. The core was composed of a group of people that were very erudite scholars. Each had a specialist in a certain part of Confucian ideology. Now, the first scholars had about 50 students each, but soon you see that the student population begins to swell to about 3,000, and it increases over time. It's huge. And eventually what you see is that eventually at first each scholar, starts small, but as people graduate, they become the empire's officials. And in turn form this new class of educated men more loyal to the central state than to the aristocratic families from which they came, because they're taken out of that position of locality and brought more to a central area. And of course, the Confucian ideas form the basis of their education, and they use that in very informal ways. And this was informally a part of the entire central role of Chinese civil servants for the next 2 millennia. Emperor Wu's state thus provided the pragmatism of legalism with intellectual training based on Confucian traditions. And in the process, he crafted this Chinese elite that was able to be connected by their participation in a shared intellectual tradition. That went on for quite some time. It was also a very highly centralized, well-organized system. The former Han state relied on agricultural resources for its support. It had a state monopoly on a lot of raw materials like iron, salt, which would give the emperor to artificially raise and lower prices for these products. It also made him money. You see the trade of luxury goods, things like silk, lacquerware, brought substantial income to the empire. But even the harsh system of government would eventually stir the people's anger. So as you can maintain this harsher system, it doesn't help. The Han, through a combination of causes, some of it probably harshness, some of it because of different power struggles when emperors die. By the end of the first century, a few local families had acquired huge estates and reduced those populations to slave. They had a lot more, they were exercising more power and more control than they probably should. By 9 CE, a usurper temporarily discontinued the Han line, and he freed the slaves, which you can imagine what that was like and the power base that he was building. But after a short, what do we got here? 15, 16-year period, the Han would regain control where local landed gentry had become even more powerful. Large numbers of peasants had rose in rebellion, and although the state would crush these, the central government was very weak. And by 220, the Han eventually, in the later Han, the Han fall, leaving China politically fragmented once again. The leaders of both the Qin and the Han were driven by a desire for centralization of power. We see this in the West too, with Rome. We'll see it in other places as well. Both in both dynasties, the Qin and the Han, government bureaucracy really applied uniform practice throughout the empire. The state would train officials chosen for their abilities. These people would, staff administration. That gives people a little bit of clout within that system. But allegiance to the state really was sort of the unifying force. And the pressures of decentralization also remained strong in the provinces. So you do have some resilient aristocratic families that maintained their wealth and allowed them to control local populations. And when a crowned emperor might pass or something like that, you could see the beginnings of a revolt. And so these competing forces of centralization and decentralization led those in power to exploit, again, the general population. And eventually you got the general population that resenting all kinds of authority and eventually overthrowing both empires because of this situation. So in that note, we're going to stay right there. And that is where we're going to stop for the Han.